Fantasy books have changed in a lot of ways over the decades, and yet in other ways they've stayed much the same, for better or worse. This is the case both for the stories in the pages and also for how the books themselves are put together and sold. A lot of classic fantasy has been described as being nearly inaccessible to modern readers simply because of how much the style of writing itself has changed. The most popular and perhaps controversial example would be a little indie hit you may have heard of called The Lord of the Rings by some guy named Tolkien or something. As iconic as the series is, it has become a popular opinion now that the writing itself is too dense and flowery to stand against the more 2000s style of sharp, to the point, and action-focused storytelling and prose. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm sure we can all see that the trends are constantly changing. And it's not always a good thing. What's shaken? My name's Cam, welcome back to the Story Nomad Inn. I make videos every single week on fantasy and horror books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. I've been talking a lot recently in my videos about how I think fantasy has changed and things that I would love to see in the fantasy genre going forward. It's with that in mind that I would love to talk to you now about some fantasy trends or tropes or whatever that I'm not really a huge fan of. Trends that aren't necessarily only in modern fantasy, but trends that have persisted, and the kind of stuff that I'm not overly keen on seeing persist much further. And the things I mentioned here are going to be a bit all over the place, but as always, I would love to hear what you think as well in the comments below. So I will be talking about plot devices and writing styles and tropes as well, but I thought I would start with the physical books themselves. I have a video where I talk about it in much more detail, but in short, I'm not a huge fan of how minimalist fantasy book covers are becoming. And it's not even something that's specific to books. I mean, it's been a big point of conversation recently how kind of garbage movie posters are getting, because they all seem to opt now for this more sleek design of floating heads, as they call it. In the past, it was a staple that we would see a scene from the book, a setting or a character presented on the cover to give us a true taste of the story inside. It would be the kind of thing that you could look at and instantly know the type of story that you were bound for. And usually they would be these beautiful painted pieces of art that could easily double up as a poster that you would hang on your wall. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of fantastic modern fantasy covers that could fall into this category. For example, the work of Felix Ortiz, probably one of my favorite book cover designers at the moment, but it seems more common now for book covers to be a lot more simple and, in my opinion, a bit more forgettable. A lot of the sleek, simple, monochromatic pieces of art do look really good, and I can appreciate that there is still a lot of talent that goes behind a lot of them, but I can't help but feel like the more modern lack of high concept illustrations are a bit of a wasted opportunity. What do you think? I'm not really sure how you guys will react to this one, but it is something that has been increasingly more grating on me, especially with every new fantasy series that I get into, and that is authors overdoing it with the amount of POVs and subplots in a single story. I'm okay with there being multiple important characters with their own arcs or even their own little stories, and I love seeing those stories through their eyes. However, it feels like nowadays there are just a few too many, if you know what I mean. I guess I just don't believe that in order for a series to be considered epic, that it has to be constantly pushing the reader's ability to keep track of what the hell is going on. This obviously isn't a new trend, by the way, but I'm surprised that it's still so common. I could be wrong, but I feel like a lot of authors are so scared of their story being considered YA or not adult that they purposefully convolute their stories with 6 or 7 different POVs or subplots. Yeah, those subplots may come together in the end, but I don't want to have to be taking notes along the way just to keep up. You know? Further to that, and more importantly, I feel like it almost always cuts the legs off as far as the pacing goes. The central plot will be reaching this climactic moment, and then we'll cut to a few chapters of some side character we've never met before doing something that is not nearly as interesting. It's a lot like TV shows that add too much filler. For example, remember when Bleach brought their apocalyptic stakes A-plot to a grinding halt for basically a whole season just so that we could watch some boring vampires complain about being immortal? Yeah, me either. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just too smooth-brained to consider myself a true fantasy fan. I won't spend too long on this point because I feel like I might be beating a dead horse. I did recently do a whole video about it. I love epic fantasy, long series with a lot of books and enormous word counts. Epics, by their very nature, are the most memorable fantasy that we will likely ever get. Spending a lot of time with a group of characters as they grow and change and overcome many different dangers is the best way for us to grow attached to these stories and create a real emotional bond. With that said, I am a little disappointed that these gigantic series have almost a monopoly on modern popular fantasy. To keep it brief, I would love to see more short, episodic, monster of the week style fantasy as well. I know that they do exist, I just wish that they had more mainstream attention and appeal. That's all. This might be a bit of a weird one, and I know it comes down to subjective taste, but the corrupt fantasy governments, or kingdoms, I don't necessarily hate this trope as a whole, and God knows it has good reason for existing and being so relatable, but I am a bit exhausted by it. If I pick up a fantasy book or a series and I'm introduced to a king or an emperor or a high-ranking authority, I'm already going to assume that they are in some way crooked. That's how I've been conditioned as a fantasy reader. I almost always end up being right about that, and I hate that. I really don't like being able to preemptively figure out a character's whole personality and motivations before that character even opens their mouth. I love having my expectations subverted, so it's always a treat when someone in a huge position of power in these fantasy governments actually ends up using that power for good, especially if I thought they were evil. It's less fun when the king is presented as being kind and good, despite their kingdom having crippling poverty, and then, surprise twist, they were a greedy turd the whole time. Crazy. I understand that a lot of fantasy, especially political fantasy, needs corrupt governments. That's usually the crux of the story. I just wish it could be a little less predictable than someone with a lot of money and power wanting more money and power, despite how comparable it may be to our real world. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that I'm conflicted on a lot of fantasy tropes and trends, and one that I have a real love-hate relationship with is the increasing habit of authors taking their fantastical plot a bit too seriously. I can enjoy a dark, gritty, violent fantasy as much as the next guy, but I have started to wonder just how far we're going to drift from the more fun and light-hearted stuff. It seems like now, if your fantasy story is considered more bright and colourful than the dark and broody stuff, it will get instantly stamped with a young adult label. I'm not a big YA reader myself, but personally I have no issue with that whole demographic or genre. I care a lot more about how entertaining the story is rather than the audience that it's written for. Hell, ever since I reread the middle grade fantasy series Del Toro Quest and I made a video about it, I've been having conversations with people about Del Toro Quest pretty much constantly, which is awesome. My point is, I have no issue with YA itself. Not everyone feels the same though, and a lot of authors seem to have a fear of falling into that category. They think they'll be taken less seriously. The humble quest story featuring soft magic and wisecracking comic reliefs seems to be being phased out for more hyper-violent political struggle styles of storytelling, and that's a bummer. By the way, I think fun fantasy can still have plenty of sex and violence. It can still be explicitly adult. I'm referring more to the general mood of cynicism versus optimism from the characters and the world itself. Like with the corrupt government thing though, I get it. It's hard to live in the world of 2022 and not have a general distrust of the future, and then not have that distrust leak into everything else, even our stories. But I think most people would say that they read fiction, especially fantasy, for the escapism, and I don't think it would hurt to have more escapism that is a little more optimistic, at least every now and then. There it is, those are just some of the common fantasy book trends that I'm growing to despise. But what about you? What do you think of any of the things I've mentioned? Are there any I missed? Old trends or new, let me know what you think. Let me know which ones irk you the most. I make videos every single week on fantasy and horror books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Thank you so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. And hey, hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.